The summer of 1889 baked the Kansas plains into a hard, cracked sheet of brown for Rosemary Hale. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy black wool dress that clung to her skin and a sky so pale and vast it offered no comfort. Her husband, a good man with soot under his nails and a laugh that could drown out the clang of his own hammer, was 2 days in the ground. The scent of funeral lilies still lingered in the small house, a sweet, cloying smell that mixed with the permanent odors of coal smoke and hot iron. She was 24 years old, and the world had shrunk to the 4 walls of a silent house and the worried face of her 12-year-old brother. Eli. He sat at the kitchen table, his small hands tracing invisible patterns on the wood, his gaze fixed on nothing. He had not cried, not once. His stillness was a heavier weight on Rosie's heart than any tear could have been. The knock on the door was not a neighborly rap of condolence. It was sharp, impatient, the sound of business. Rosie smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and opened it. Jebediah Crane, her late husband's uncle by marriage, stood on the porch. He was a man made of dry paper and thin wire, with a face that looked as though it had been soured by a lifetime of sucking on lemons. His suit was dark and severe, a stark contrast to the dust and glare of the afternoon. He was not alone. 2 of his grown sons, hulking figures with their father's joyless eyes, flanked him like a pair of mismatched bookends. Jebediah did not offer his hand or a word of sympathy. He held up a sheaf of papers. "This is a matter of custom, Rosemary, and of law. The estate must be settled." Rosie looked at the papers, then back at his face. "The estate, Jebediah. There is the smithy, this house. It is not much." "It is enough to have debts," he said, his voice as crisp as a dead leaf. "Your husband, God rest his soul, was not a man for meticulous books. As the widow, tradition dictates your dower portion, but the debts of the family must be cleared first." He stepped past her into the house, his sons following, their boots scraping on the clean floorboards. Eli shrank back in his chair. Jebediah's eyes swept the room, not seeing a home filled with memories, but an inventory of assets. He ticked items off in his head: the sturdy oak table, the pie safe her husband had built, the 2 good milking cows in the paddock. Rosie's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What debts? We owed no one. We paid our way." "A common misconception among women," Jebediah said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Men have dealings. Your husband had an arrangement with me, a loan for iron stock 2 winters ago. It has accrued interest." He slid a paper across the table. It was a promissory note, filled with dense, spidery script and bearing a signature that was a cruel, clumsy imitation of her husband's hand. Rosie stared at it, a cold knot forming in her stomach. It was a lie, a bald, shameless lie forged on the fresh grief of a man's death. She knew her husband's signature as well as she knew her own name. He had never signed a document without a small, proud flourish on the final letter. This signature was flat, dead. "This is not his hand," she said, her voice low but clear. "Grief plays tricks on the memory," Jebediah replied, his thin lips pulling back in something that was not a smile. "The note is legally sound. The smithy and its tools will cover a portion, the house and its contents, the livestock. They should satisfy the remainder. We are being generous. In fact, we will not pursue you for the shortfall." They were taking everything, every nail, every board, every memory. They were stripping her life down to the bone, using the blunt instruments of custom and deceit. She looked at Eli, whose eyes were now wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. His fear was the spark that ignited her own quiet resolve. She would not beg, she would not weep in front of these vultures. "You will find us gone by morning," she said. Her voice did not tremble. Jebediah nodded, satisfied. "A wise decision. The wagon is outside. My boys will begin loading the smithy's tools." Rosie turned her back on them. She walked to her brother, placing her hands on his small shoulders. "Go to our room," Eli. Pack a bag, only what you can carry. Your drawing pencils, your map paper, your good boots." He looked up at her, his lips parted to speak, but he saw the iron in her eyes and simply nodded. He slid from his chair and walked away, his back ramrod straight. Rosie moved through the house with a numb efficiency, a ghost in her own life. She packed a single carpet bag with a change of clothes for each of them, the family Bible, a small tin of her mother's sewing needles, and the handful of coins she had saved in a sugar bowl. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough, but it was theirs. That night, under the cold indifference of 1,000 stars, she and Eli slipped out the back door, the sounds of the crane men moving furniture, their grunts and scrapes echoing in the darkness, were the final punctuation on her life in Kansas. They did not look back. They walked the dusty miles to the railhead, the rhythmic chirp of crickets the only sound besides their footsteps. The midnight train was a terrifying beast of steam and iron, hissing and groaning as it prepared to tear a hole through the darkness. Rosie bought 2 tickets with nearly all the money she had left. They were not for the passenger cars, with their plush seats and glass windows. They were for a place in a freight car, heading west into the Wyoming Territory, a name she had only ever seen on a map. It was a place of emptiness, of mountains and rumored fortunes, a place far enough away from the reach of Jebediah Crane. The freight car was cavernous and dark, smelling of sawdust, old hay, and the faint, bitter tang of machine oil. The air was close, the rolling of the wheels a constant, bone-jarring thunder beneath them. They found a space in a corner, huddling together for warmth as the train lurched into motion. They were not alone. A man sat near the opposite door, a dark silhouette against the slivers of moonlight piercing through the slats. He was large, his shoulders broad enough to block out a significant portion of the view. A long canvas bundle lay at his feet. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they could see he was watching them, not with aggression, but with a quiet, steady curiosity. Rosie held Eli closer. The man shifted, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He had a hat pulled low, shadowing his face, but they could feel his gaze. After a long silence, his voice came, a low rumble that seemed to be part of the train itself. He spoke. "Can you tell the difference between the scream of a mountain cat and a train letting off steam?" The question was so unexpected, so strange, that Rosie was momentarily speechless. She tightened her grip on Eli's shoulder, her mind racing through a dozen fears. She did not look at him, keeping her eyes on the dark shape of her brother. "I only know the sound of an empty belly." Her answer was honest and sharp, a small stone of defiance thrown into the dark. She felt, rather than saw, the man's slight nod. A long moment passed. Then his arm moved, and something slid across the rough floorboards, stopping near her foot. It was a small parcel wrapped in butcher paper. "My dinner," he said. "Seems my eyes were bigger than my stomach tonight." Rosie stared at the package. It could be anything. It could be a trick, but the smell that rose from it was warm and savory. Smoked meat. Her own stomach growled in shameless response, a sound loud enough to be heard over the train's clamor. Eli looked up at her, his hunger plain in the pale oval of his face. Slowly, she reached for it. The paper was still warm. Inside was a thick piece of jerky and a hard biscuit. It was plain fare, but to them, it was a banquet. She broke the biscuit, giving the larger piece to Eli, and tore the jerky in 2. They ate in silence, the man across the car seeming to have forgotten their existence entirely, his gaze now fixed on the fleeting landscape. The man's name was Colt Ashford, though she would not learn that for some time. He was returning to his ranch in Wyoming, a spread of land near a small, thirsty town called Dry Creek. The long bundle at his feet was a new saddle, custom made in St. Louis, a masterpiece of tooled leather and silver conchos that had cost him a small fortune. It was a tool, but also a piece of his history, a connection to the life he had built. As dawn began to bleed gray light into the car, The landscape outside transformed. The flat, predictable plains of Kansas gave way to rolling, golden brown hills that rose into jagged buttes. The air that drifted through the slats was different, drier, with a faint, clean scent of sage and pine and something else, a mineral tang like salt, far in the distance. A wall of mountains stood against the sky, their peaks a deep, bruised purple. It was a beautiful country, but a hard one. It promised nothing. Other men in the car, rough-looking prospectors and ranch hands, began to stir and talk. Their conversation was of land and water, of opportunity and ruin. A name surfaced again and again, Silas Morton. He was a man from back east, they said an agent for the railroad, and he was buying up every dusty acre he could get his hands on, especially land with so much as a trickle of water. The rumor was the Union Pacific was planning a new spur line, and where the railroad went, towns and fortunes followed. Silas Morton meant to be there first, owning the land and, more importantly, the water that would give it life. Rosie listened, the names and places meaning nothing to her. Her world had been reduced to the next step, the next meal, the next sunrise. She looked out at the vast, empty land stretching to the horizon. It was a place that could swallow a person whole, a place where a penniless widow and her young brother could disappear without a trace. The train whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the hills. Ahead, a small collection of wooden buildings shimmered in the morning heat, a tiny outpost of civilization clinging to the edge of a vast wilderness. Dry Creek. Eli pressed his face to the slats, his weariness forgotten, his eyes wide with the nervous excitement of a boy seeing a new world. He looked back at Rosie, a question in his eyes. "Is this it? Is this where we stop?" Rosie nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She gathered their single bag, her hand finding Eli's and holding on tight. Yes, she thought, her heart a heavy, uncertain drum in her chest. This is where we stop. This is where we try to begin again. The dry wind that swirled into the car as the train slowed was not a welcome. It was a challenge, a gritty, unforgiving breath that tasted of dust and distance and the hard truth of survival. The dust of Dry Creek was a fine red powder that coated everything. It rose in lazy clouds from beneath their boots, settled on the shoulders of Rosie's dark dress, and worked its way into the folds of their meager belongings. The town was little more than a single street of unpainted wooden buildings, staring at each other across the expanse of dirt under a sun that had already begun to burn with a white-hot intensity. A saloon, a general store, a livery stable, and a handful of other structures stood as a testament to stubbornness in the face of an overwhelming emptiness. Eli's hand was a small, tight knot in hers. He looked at the hard faces of the men who lounged on the boardwalks, their eyes lingering on Rosie with a mixture of appraisal and pity. She pulled her bonnet lower and walked with a straight-backed purpose she did not feel, heading for the largest building, a two-story affair with a sign that read Nora Quinn's Eatery and Rooms. The moment they stepped inside, they were assaulted by the smells of stale beer, frying bacon, and strong coffee. The room was dim, a welcome respite from the glare outside. A woman stood behind a long wooden bar, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She was tall, with hair the color of a sunset and eyes that missed nothing. This had to be Nora Quinn. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice raspy but not unkind. "Work," Rosie said, the word coming out before she could lose her nerve. "And a room. We can pay." She did not add that they could only pay for a night or two. Nora's eyes flickered from Rosie to Eli and back again. She took in the worn dress, the single carpet bag, the exhaustion etched onto Rosie's face. "What can you do?" "I can cook, clean, scrub floors, mend clothes. I am a hard worker. My brother can help." Nora looked at Eli, who stood straight and met her gaze. "He does not look like he would be much help with a mop. What is your name?" "Rosemary Hale. This is my brother, Eli." "A widow," Nora stated. It was not a question. The black dress was its own announcement. She sighed, a sound like sand shifting. "I need someone to wash dishes and peel potatoes. It is 10 hours a day, sun up to sundown. The pay is 50 cents a day, plus your meals. The room upstairs is another 2 bits a day. You will not get rich." "We will take it," Rosie said, relief washing over her so intensely she felt lightheaded. As she spoke, the bat-wing doors swung open and the man from the train stepped inside. Colt Ashford. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair and a face that was all angles and planes, tanned by the sun and lined with a seriousness that seemed older than his years. He nodded once to Nora, his eyes briefly finding Rosie and Eli in the corner. He did not acknowledge them further, but a silent communication passed between him and Nora. He laid a few coins on the bar, spoke a few quiet words Nora's way, and then left as quickly as he had come. Nora scooped up the coins. "All right, Hale, your first week's lodging is covered, an advance on your wages." She said it without looking at Rosie, turning to place a key on the bar. "Room 4, at the top of the stairs. Be down here at 5 in the morning." Rosie knew it was not an advance. She had seen the exchange. She looked toward the door where the quiet man had disappeared, a warmth of confusion and gratitude spreading through her chest. She simply said, "Thank you," and taking the key, led Eli upstairs. The work was as hard as Nora had promised. Rosie's hands, accustomed to housework but not the relentless onslaught of a commercial kitchen, were soon raw and chapped. She scrubbed pots caked with old stew, washed mountains of greasy plates, and peeled so many potatoes and onions that her fingers were permanently stained and her eyes constantly watered. But she worked without complaint, her movements quick and efficient. Eli, too small for the heavy labor, found his own purpose. With the town as his base, he spent his days exploring the surrounding landscape. He had a natural gift for seeing the lay of the land, for understanding how water moved and how the hills folded into one another. He spent his few pennies on drawing paper at the general store and with a charcoal pencil began to create a map. It was a thing of remarkable detail and accuracy, charting the barely there trickle of Dry Creek, the location of every significant rock formation, and the shallow ravines where water might gather after a rare rain. Gossip in a small town moves faster than a prairie fire. Rosie learned to block out the whispers of the other women who came into the eatery. A widow, penniless, they would say, their voices hushed but carrying, with a young boy to feed. She is a tempting target for the wrong kind of man. They looked at her with a mix of suspicion and condescending sympathy, as if her poverty were a moral failing. One afternoon, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a suit too fine for Dry Creek sat at one of her tables. He introduced himself as Silas Morton. He had a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and his eyes had the acquisitive gleam of a magpie. He tried to draw her into conversation, asking where she was from, what had brought her to Wyoming. Rosie answered with polite, brief sentences, her hands never still as she wiped down the table. His interest felt oily, and she instinctively recoiled. Later that week, Deputy Hank Lozano came in for his supper. He was a lean man with a kind, weathered face, his heritage announced in his dark eyes and the silver trim on his gun belt. He sat at the bar and spoke quietly with Nora, but his gaze kept shifting to where Rosie was working. When he finished his meal, he approached her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone, "I do not mean to pry, but I saw Silas Morton talking to you the other day." "He is a land agent," Rosie replied, keeping her own voice neutral. "He is more than that. He is a predator. He wants something in this valley. Specifically, he wants the water that flows from Colt Ashford's land. Ashford Springs is the only reliable source for miles. Morton has made offers. Ashford has refused. When a man like Morton does not get what he wants with money, he tries other ways. Be careful. A woman alone is seen as a weakness he might try to exploit." The deputy's warning chilled her. She was a pawn in a game she did not understand. a game played by powerful men for stakes of land and water that meant life or death in this country. 2 weeks into her new life, Colt Ashford came back to town. He did not come to the eatery. Instead, Nora delivered a message. "Mr. Ashford would like to see you. At the livery. He has a business proposition." Rosie wiped her hands on her apron, her heart thumping with a nervous rhythm. She found him in the livery, checking the hooves of a large bay horse. The smell of horses and hay was a clean, honest smell after the greasy confines of the kitchen. "You sent for me, Mr. Ashford." He straightened up, turning to face her. He was even taller than she remembered. "Yes, Nora tells me you are quick with numbers." "I can add and subtract," she said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "This is my ranch's account book. It is a mess. I buy and sell cattle. I pay my hands. I order supplies. The numbers are all there, but they do not make any sense to me. I need someone to put them in order, to keep inventory. The job is yours if you want it. The pay is 4 times what Nora gives you. You and the boy could have a place to stay out at the ranch. There is a small guest cabin." Rosie was stunned. "Why me?" "Because I saw you on the train. You did not panic, and I saw how you looked at that forged note Jebediah Crane showed you. You knew it was a lie in an instant. You see things for what they are. I need that. And," he added, with the faintest hint of a smile, "Nora says you can count a stack of plates faster than she can. I figure you can count cattle without missing a tail." And so a new chapter began. The guest cabin at the Ashford Ranch was small and rustic, but it was clean and tight against the wind. For the first time in weeks, Rosie and Eli had a space that was their own during the day. Rosie sat at a desk in the main ranch house, painstakingly working her way through Colt's chaotic ledger. She discovered she had a mind for it, a knack for bringing order to the chaos of numbers. Colt would watch her sometimes, a silent, assessing presence. But he never interfered. He would answer her questions with brief, direct answers. And she began to piece together the picture of a man who ran a large and successful operation, but who cared little for the paperwork that went with it. While Rosie worked, Eli explored. The ranch was a new, exciting territory for his maps. One afternoon, he followed a small, spring-fed creek that wound its way from the base of the hills down toward the main pasture. It was part of the network of water that came from Ashford Springs. As he walked, he noticed something odd. The creek, which should have flowed straight, made a sharp, unnatural turn. Curious. He pushed through a thicket of willows and found the cause. A low wall of rocks and packed earth had been built across the stream bed, a makeshift dam. It was cleverly hidden, designed to divert a small but steady flow of water away from Ashford's land and into a dry gully that led toward a parcel of land downstream. Eli, with his cartographer's eye, knew without a doubt where that gully ended. It was on the section of land everyone in town knew had recently been purchased by Silas Morton. He carefully drew the dam and the diverted waterway onto his map. That night, a strange restlessness hung in the air. The wind picked up, howling down from the mountains with a mournful sound. Rosie was checking a final column of figures when she heard the shouting. She looked out the window and saw a terrifying orange glow against the blackness. The stable was on fire. She ran outside, her heart seizing with fear. Men were yelling, horses were screaming, and the roar of the flames was a living, hungry sound. Colt was already there, a silhouette against the fire, shouting orders, organizing a bucket brigade from the main well. Rosie did not hesitate. She grabbed a bucket and joined the line, her arms and back straining as she passed the heavy, sloshing pails of water down the line to the men at the front. The heat was intense, and the smoke was a choking blanket. Through the chaos, she saw a small figure dart toward the burning stable. It was Eli. Rosie's blood ran cold. Eli, no. But he was already slipping through the main doors, disappearing into the inferno. A moment later, he staggered back out, coughing, his face smudged with soot. He was dragging something heavy. It was Colt's new saddle, the one from the train. He had seen where the ranch hands had placed it, just inside the door, and knew what it meant to the quiet man who had given them a home. They finally got the fire under control, but the stable was a smoldering ruin. The horses had been saved, but the structure was a total loss. As the adrenaline faded, leaving them all exhausted and shivering in the wind, Colt walked over to where Rosie and Eli stood huddled together. He looked at the scorched but intact saddle lying on the ground. Then he looked at Eli, and then at Rosie, who had a long, angry red burn on her forearm from a flying ember. He reached out, his rough fingers gently touching the back of her uninjured hand. His gaze was direct, his eyes holding a depth of emotion he never showed in his face. The thanks were for both of them, for the woman who had fought the fire like a man and the boy who had risked his life for a piece of leather and silver. He said only 4 words, his voice low and raspy from the smoke. "This favor I will repay." He turned and walked away to assess the damage, leaving Rosie standing in the red dust, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The dust, stirred up by the frantic activity, was settling again. A fine crimson veil over the blackened timbers of the stable and the weary faces of the ranch hands. It was the color of a wound, she thought, but it was also the color of the earth, the rich, vital soil that, with enough water and enough courage, could still be made to grow something new. The weeks after the fire settled into a new rhythm, one marked by the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sounds of hammers and saws. Colt had hired men from town to rebuild the stable, and the work progressed with a steady, determined pace. Rosie found a strange comfort in the noise, a sound of creation after destruction. She continued her work on the ledgers, bringing a quiet order to the sprawling finances of the Ashford Ranch. The numbers told a story of a man who was shrewd in his dealings with cattle, but generous with his men. A man who owned a small but profitable silver claim in the hills, making him, by the standards of this dusty territory, a wealthy man. He was, as the whispers in town had named him, a cowboy millionaire. The quiet, however, was not destined to last. It was broken one blistering afternoon by the arrival of a buckboard wagon that rattled up the long drive to the ranch house. Rosie, who was on the porch mending one of Eli's shirts, felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. She recognized the gaunt, severe figure holding the reins. It was Jebediah Crane. He did not wait for an invitation. Stepping down from the wagon with a stiff, proprietary air, he carried a worn leather satchel. He looked at the new stable being framed, at the expanse of the ranch, and his thin lips tightened with a sour disapproval. "So, this is where you ran to, Rosemary, finding shelter under another man's roof." His voice was as dry and grating as stones rubbing together. "What do you want, Jebediah?" she asked, rising to her feet, her needle and thread forgotten in her lap. "Justice," he said, pulling a folded document from his satchel, "and the settlement of our family's accounts. This is a legally binding summons from the circuit court in Kansas. The debt remains." He held it out to her. The official seals and dense legal text were meant to intimidate, to crush her will with the weight of the law. "I told you that note was a forgery." "An accusation you cannot prove. I, on the other hand, have a signed document. I am here to offer you a final chance to settle this matter amicably. Sign this reconciliation agreement. It acknowledges the debt, but in exchange for your signature, I will agree to a long-term payment plan, a small portion of your wages, whatever they may be, for the rest of your life. It is a most generous offer." It was a life sentence of servitude, a chain that would bind her forever to the man who had stolen her home. Before she could answer, Colt Ashford stepped out of the ranch house. He had been in his office, just inside the open door, and had heard everything. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was more menacing than any sudden motion. He did not look at the paper. He looked at Jebediah Crane. "You are on private land," he said, his voice a low rumble. "State your business and leave." "This is a family matter, Mr. Ashford," Jebediah said, trying to regain his footing. "You made it my business when you came up my drive. Mrs. Hale is in my employ. You are harassing my staff." Rosie watched the two men, a study in contrasts. Jebediah, all sharp angles and brittle pride, and Colt, solid and unmovable as the mountains behind him. "I will not sign it," Rosie said, her voice clear and strong. She looked directly at Jebediah. "You will get nothing from me because you are owed nothing. Now, as Mr. Ashford said, leave." For a moment, Jebediah's composure cracked, and a flash of raw fury showed in his eyes. He crumpled the summons in his fist. "You will regret this, Rosemary. The law has a long arm." He turned on his heel, climbed back into his buckboard, and whipped his horse into a dusty retreat down the drive. That evening, another visitor came to the ranch. This one was announced by the purr of expensive carriage wheels. Silas Morton stepped onto the porch, his fine suit unblemished by the dust, a bottle of what looked like French brandy in his hand. "A difficult day. I hear Mrs. Hale," he said with his oily smile. "I came as soon as the news reached town." Rosie remained standing, her arms crossed. "There is nothing for you here, Mr. Morton. Please," he said, holding up a hand. "I come as a friend. I understand your predicament. A woman of your character, hounded by such a contemptible man over a paltry debt. It is an injustice." He was a snake, and she could see the flick of his forked tongue. "I wish to help," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I would be honored to settle this debt for you. Consider it a gift, no strings attached." Rosie stared at him, her silence a question. "All I ask," he added, as if it were an afterthought, "is that you might put in a good word for me with Mr. Ashford. He is a stubborn man. He fails to see the great prosperity the railroad will bring to this valley. His water rights are the key. If he would only be reasonable and sell them to me for a very handsome price. Of course, this entire region would flourish. Your word, as a trusted employee, might just be enough to persuade him." The trap was laid, baited with her freedom. He would buy her, and then use her to gut the very man who had given her shelter. "The answer is no," she said. "I would rather be in Jebediah's debt for 100 years than be in yours for a single minute." Morton's smile vanished. "You are making a mistake, Mrs. Hale. A very big mistake." He turned and left, the expensive brandy still in his hand. Later, as Rosie sat staring into the fire in her small cabin, Colt knocked on the door. He did not enter, just stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "What they offered you," he said. "Morton, I know what it was." "I did not accept." "I know. I want you to know something. Your position here is secure. This cabin is your home for as long as you need it. I am giving you an advance on your wages, enough to hire a real lawyer if Crane tries to bring this to a territorial court. You are not in this alone." Rosie looked up at him, her heart aching with a gratitude so fierce it was painful. She was terrified of being a burden, of this debt of kindness growing so large she could never repay it. Her pride, the only thing Jebediah had not been able to take from her, bristled at the thought. But the look in Colt's eyes was not one of pity. It was one of respect. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded and left her to her thoughts. The following Sunday, another visitor arrived. This one came not in a carriage or a dusty buckboard, but on foot, a solitary, black-clad figure walking up from the town. It was Pastor Temperance Reed, the spiritual shepherd of Dry Creek. She was a stern, unsmiling woman whose sermons were famous for their fire and brimstone. She accepted a glass of water on the porch but refused to sit. "I came to inquire after your welfare, Mrs. Hale," she said, her eyes boring into Rosie's. "The town is alive with talk. Your name is on everyone's lips." Rosie waited. A woman's reputation, especially a widow's in a place like this, is a fragile thing. It is like the first ice on a pond in autumn. It can look solid, but a single misstep can send you into the freezing depths. You are living here, on this ranch, under the protection of an unmarried man. It is a business arrangement. Pastor, I work for Mr. Ashford. Appearances matter, the pastor insisted. The world is quick to judge. I am counseling you to be cautious, to guard your honor as you would guard your life. It was a warning, delivered under the guise of spiritual concern. She was being told that her position was precarious, that the community's goodwill was conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment. The days that followed were tense, but Rosie threw herself into her work. One morning, Colt found her staring out the office window at the far pasture, where a few of his hands were branding newborn calves. "You look like you're trying to balance that ledger with your eyes," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I was just watching. It looks complicated." "It is. Come on." He led her out into the bright sunlight and down to the corrals. The air was filled with the smell of burning hair, the bawling of calves, and the lowing of their anxious mothers. One of the hands had just roped a small, kicking calf and was struggling to hold it down. "You want to learn something useful," he said to Rosie. "Learn this." He showed her how to quickly loop a rope around the calf's legs, using leverage and a quick, practiced motion to immobilize the animal. "It is called flanking. Now you try." The next calf they brought down was a bundle of panicked energy. Rosie, following his instructions, tried to secure the rope, but her fingers fumbled, and the calf kicked free. "You are thinking too much," he said. "You look at that calf like it is a column of numbers you have to add up. It is not. It is just an animal. Feel what it is going to do." She tried again, her face set with determination. This time, she moved with the calf, anticipating its struggle, and the rope held fast. She looked up at him, a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a triumphant smile on her face. "Not bad," he admitted. "You read a kicking calf almost as well as you read a ledger." "And you keep accounts about as well as you rope a fence post," she retorted, the witty reply surprising them both. A real smile touched his lips, a rare thing that transformed his serious face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a widow or an employee, but as a woman, strong and resilient and unexpectedly funny. The moment was broken by the call of a ranch hand, but something had shifted between them, a small spark of warmth in the professional distance they had maintained. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, an old prospector named Whitaker stopped by the ranch for a cup of coffee. He was a fixture in the territory, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose eyes had seen a half-century of boom and bust. He and Colt were talking about the fire when the subject of Silas Morton came up. "That one. He is after more than land," Whitaker said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "He is after the heart of this place. He is after your water." "Colt." "Everyone knows that," Colt said. "Aye, but they do not know the whole story. I was here when your grandfather first put down stakes. He was a smart man, knew that in this country, water was more precious than gold. He did not just file a claim at the land office. He was a lawyer back east. You see, he drew up a document, a proper deed, a handwritten right to every drop that comes out of those springs, from the source to the sea, as he used to say, had it witnessed by the Shoshone chief who was here then. It was an ironclad thing, better than any government paper." Colt frowned. "I have never seen any such document." "Your granddaddy was a peculiar man. He did not trust banks or safes, said the safest place for a thing was where no one would ever think to look. He hid it somewhere on this ranch. He died before he told your father where. Most folks have forgotten it ever existed. But I remember, if a man like Morton got his hands on it, he could not touch a drop of your water. But if it stays lost, well, a slick lawyer and a paid-off judge can do a lot of damage with a standard claim." The old man finished his coffee, nodded his goodbyes, and shuffled off into the twilight. Rosie stood on the porch, watching him go. A lost document, a hidden key. It was a sliver of hope, but it was buried somewhere in the long history of this vast ranch. She was grateful for Colt's protection, for his quiet strength, but the fear of being indebted to him was a constant, nagging presence. She had to stand on her own feet. She had to find a way to fight her own battles. Inside the main house, Colt stood by the window, looking out at the dark outline of the guest cabin. He had not felt this way since his wife had died 5 years ago. This quiet, fierce woman with the intelligent eyes had slipped past the defenses he had so carefully built around his heart. The feeling scared him. It felt like a betrayal of a memory he had sworn to honor. He was a man who knew how to fight for his land, for his water, for his ranch. But he did not know how to fight this. He did not know if he even wanted to. The sky was the first to give warning. It bled from a pale, washed-out blue to a sickly yellow, the color of old bruises. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric silence. The birds stopped singing. The insects fell quiet. Even the wind, that constant, restless voice of the prairie, held its breath. Colt Ashford stood on the porch of the main house. His eyes narrowed on the horizon. A low, dark wall was building in the west, a roiling mass that was not a cloud but the land itself, rising up to swallow the sun. "Dust storm," he said, his voice flat and hard, "and a bad one." The ranch exploded into a flurry of controlled chaos. The hands moved with the grim efficiency of men who knew the enemy. They hazed the horses into the newly built stable, reinforced the corral gates, and double-checked the latches on every door and window. The cattle, however, were another matter. Hundreds of them were spread across the upper pastures, and they could smell the change in the air. They grew restless, their lowing taking on a frantic, fearful edge. Rosie herded Eli into their small cabin, stuffing rags into the cracks around the door and the single window. But she could not stay inside. This was her home now, in a way, and the threat against the ranch felt like a threat against her. She ran to the main house. "What can I do?" she asked Colt, her voice nearly lost in the first gust of wind, which hit the house with the force of a physical blow. "Stay inside. It is not safe." "I am not made of glass," she shot back. "Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a half-second, saw the iron resolve in her eyes, and wasted no more time arguing. "The well. We need to draw as much water as we can before the air gets too thick to breathe. Fill every bucket, every trough, every barrel." The work was brutal, the hand pump was heavy, and her arms and back soon screamed in protest. Eli, refusing to be left behind, worked alongside her, his small frame straining to carry buckets that were half his weight. The wind rose to a demonic shriek, and the sky went from yellow to a deep, angry orange. Then the first wave of dust hit, a gritty, blinding fog that reduced visibility to a few feet and turned the world into a suffocating, monochrome twilight. It was impossible to see, to breathe. The fine, abrasive powder filled Rosie's mouth and nose, coated her throat, and stung her eyes. The ranch hands became ghosts, shouting to one another through the swirling gloom. The cattle, now fully panicked, broke through a section of fence and scattered into the storm, their terrified bellows swallowed by the wind. For hours, they fought. Rosie and Eli kept a steady supply of water moving from the well to the house and the stable, their faces covered with damp cloths that did little to stop the choking dust. Rosie's fear for Eli was a sharp, constant pain, but she could also see a fierce pride in his face. He was not a child hiding from the storm. He was one of the defenders of the ranch. When the storm finally passed, hours later, it left behind a world transformed. A thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening every edge, silencing every sound. The sun was a pale, hazy disk in a copper sky. The silence was profound, the silence of exhaustion and devastation. The herd was scattered, the precious water from Ashford Springs, the lifeblood of the ranch, was choked with silt, the flow reduced to a muddy trickle. For the next 2 days, everyone worked from before dawn until long after dusk. Colt led the men out to scour the hills and ravines, painstakingly gathering the lost cattle. Rosie and Eli took on the task of clearing the springs. They worked with shovels and buckets, digging out the thick clay like mud, their muscles aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. It was slow, back-breaking labor, but with every bucket of sludge they removed, the water flowed a little clearer, a little stronger. They were not just cleaning a spring, they were resuscitating the heart of the ranch. On the evening of the second day, the last of the cattle had been found, and the spring was running clear again. A weary peace settled over the valley. Rosie sat on the small porch of her cabin, too tired to even wash the grime from her face and hands. The air was cool and clean, and the stars were beginning to appear, sharp and brilliant in the scrubbed sky. She heard the crunch of boots on the dusty ground and looked up to see Colt approaching. He carried a lantern, and its golden light cast long, dancing shadows. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his face half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "I came to see how you were," he said. "We are fine," she answered, her voice raspy, just tired. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze taking in the small, sturdy cabin, then settling on her. He walked up the steps and sat on the top step, not beside her, but near her feet. He set the lantern down between them. "The men are talking," he said quietly. "About you, about the boy. They saw what you did during the storm, at the spring. This place, it tests people. It breaks some and it tempers others." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy iron key. It was old and plain. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "This is the key to this cabin. It is not my key. It is yours. You were left penniless by your late husband's kin. I cannot let you and Eli drift on the wind. This is your home." His voice was low, stripped of all artifice, each word laid down with a solemn weight. Rosie stared at the key, a lump forming in her throat. A home, a place of safety. It was everything she had prayed for. He did not pull his hand back, and if you want it, he continued, his voice even softer, "Here is my heart as well." The world seemed to stop. The chirping of the crickets, the sigh of the night breeze. It all faded away. There was only the warm light of the lantern, the heavy key in his outstretched hand, and the raw, vulnerable truth in his eyes. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to join her. Her own heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She was drawn to his strength, his quiet decency, his unexpected kindness, but she was also terrified. Her life had been defined by what she owed others as a daughter, a sister, a wife. To accept his heart felt like accepting another debt, the greatest one of all, one she might never be able to repay. Her independence was a new and fragile thing, and she did not know how to hold on to it while leaning on someone else. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the key. Its metal was cool and solid in her palm. "Thank you for the home. Colt," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For me and for Eli. We will accept it. For now." She deliberately ignored the second part of his offer. She could not yet. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a quiet understanding. He nodded slowly. "For now is good enough." He stood up, leaving the lantern on the porch. "Good night, Rosie." He turned and walked back into the darkness, his footsteps receding until they were gone. Rosie sat for a long time, the key clutched in her hand, its hard edges pressing into her skin. The lantern cast a warm, protective glow around her, a small circle of light in the vast, dark expanse of Wyoming. A few days later, a semblance of normality had returned to the ranch. The dust had been swept, the repairs made, and the rhythm of work re-established. Eli, his mapping obsession rekindled, decided to chart the ranch buildings themselves. He was particularly fascinated by an old, dilapidated storage shed that stood near the back of the property. Far from the main house, It had been one of the original structures on the ranch, built by Colt's grandfather, and had long since fallen into disuse, its timbers warped and its roof sagging. Colt had warned him to be careful, but a boy's curiosity is a powerful force. Eli slipped inside the shed one afternoon, the interior dim and smelling of dust and decay. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating dust motes and intricate spider webs. Old tools, broken harnesses, and stacks of rotting barrels were piled in the corners. He was tracing the outline of a massive, hand-hewn support post in the center of the shed when he noticed something odd. A section of the wood, about chest-high, looked different. It was a small, square piece that did not quite match the grain of the rest of the post. He pushed on it. It was loose. He worked his small fingers into the crack and pried. The wooden plug came free, revealing a dark, hollow space inside the beam. His heart began to pound with the thrill of discovery. Reaching deep into the hollow, his fingers brushed against something wrapped in oiled cloth. It was a flat, rectangular package. He pulled it out into the light. The oilskin was stiff and yellowed with age, tied with a leather thong that crumbled as he untied it. Inside was a slim, leather-bound notebook. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. It was some kind of journal or ledger. At the bottom of one of the first pages were two signatures. One was clear and strong, Jonathan Ashford. The other was not a signature, but a mark. A pictograph of a soaring eagle next to a man's name, Chief Blackhawk. Eli did not understand all the words, but he knew he had found something important. He clutched the book to his chest and ran from the shed, kicking up dust as he raced toward the main house, toward the one person he knew would understand what it meant. He burst onto the porch where Rosie was sitting, her head bent over the account books. "I found it," he shouted, his voice breathless with excitement. "I found the secret." The leather of the old notebook was dry and cracked, but the pages inside were remarkably preserved. Colt Ashford handled it with a reverence Rosie had never seen in him, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned the brittle pages. They sat at the main house's heavy oak table, the oil lamp casting a circle of golden light, pushing back the evening shadows. Eli stood between them, his eyes wide, vibrating with the importance of his discovery. "It is just as Whitaker said," Colt murmured, his voice low with awe. He pointed to a paragraph written in his grandfather's elegant hand. "Here, it grants him and his heirs in perpetuity sole and exclusive right to all water emerging from the geological formation known as Ashford Springs. It describes the boundaries with painstaking detail. And here, he traced the pictograph signature, is the mark of Chief Blackhawk. As witness, this is not a claim, it is a treaty." They finally had it. The shield they had been looking for, forged in ink and honor a generation ago. The next morning, armed with this newfound certainty, Colt rode into town with Deputy Hank Lozano. Rosie watched them go, the old book wrapped carefully in cloth and secured in Colt's saddlebag. They were not gone long. They rode directly to the parcel of land owned by Silas Morton, following the detailed drawing on Eli's map. They found the illegal ditch exactly where Eli had drawn it, a fresh wound in the earth, cleverly hidden by a screen of willows. The water, clear and cold, was being siphoned away from Ashford's pasture and into Morton's dry gully. Deputy Hank documented the diversion, his face grim. When Morton arrived, summoned by one of his men, he feigned ignorance with a practiced smoothness. "My goodness, Deputy, it seems some of my overzealous workers have been a bit ambitious in their landscaping. A misunderstanding, I assure you. I will have it dismantled at once." "There will be a fine..." "Morton," Hank said, his voice hard. "And this is your only warning." The news of the discovered deed and the exposed diversion ditch spread through Dry Creek like a contagion. It forced the opposing players into the open. That evening, in the smoky back room of the saloon, Silas Morton poured a glass of whiskey for a visitor he had been expecting. Jebediah Crane accepted the glass, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "It seems our cowboy has found some old piece of paper," Morton said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It complicates matters." "It changes nothing," Jebediah corrected him. "An old, handwritten document unregistered with the territorial office. I can bury it in legal challenges for a decade. The key is public opinion and leverage." Morton smiled his predatory smile. "Precisely. We need to frame Ashford as an enemy of progress, and his little widow friend, she is his weak point. We squeeze her. He feels the pressure." "We do more than that," Jebediah said, his voice a dry whisper. "We offer the town a future he is denying them, and if he continues to be an obstacle, we promise you a portion of the profits when his holdings are broken up." Their handshake sealed the unholy alliance, a pact of greed and power aimed squarely at the Ashford Ranch. Their first move was to call a town meeting. The notice, posted in the general store, promised a discussion on the future prosperity of Dry Creek, sponsored by Mr. Silas Morton of the Union Pacific Railroad. The entire town turned out, packing into the small, stuffy town hall, their faces a mixture of hope and suspicion. Morton stood at the front, looking polished and confident. He spoke of a glorious future, of a rail spur that would connect Dry Creek to the world. He painted a vivid picture of new businesses, a school, a proper doctor, a town that would be a jewel of the territory. "All that stands in the way," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity, "is one man's refusal to share. One man, sitting on the water that is the lifeblood of this entire valley, refusing to sell his rights for a price that would make him 10 times the millionaire he already is. He is holding your future hostage for his own selfish reasons." A murmur went through the crowd. He was a masterful speaker, preying on their fears of being left behind, of their children having to move away to find work. Colt started to rise, his face a mask of thunder, but Rosie put a hand on his arm, a silent plea to let her speak. She had not planned this, but listening to Morton's poisonous words, something inside her solidified. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was just a widow in a mended dress, but she had to say something. Every eye in the room turned to her. "My name is Rosemary Hale," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "I am not a person of property, and I do not know much about railroads. But I know about loss. I know what it is to have everything taken from you by men who twist words and customs to suit their own greed." She looked around at the faces of the townspeople, at the wives of ranchers and the shopkeepers. "Mr. Morton talks about progress. But what is progress if it means taking the heart out of a community? That water he wants to buy is not just a commodity. It is this town's heart. It waters your cattle. It grows the food in your gardens. It is what your children drink. It belongs to this valley. Colt Ashford is not hoarding it. He is protecting it. For all of us." She finished, her cheeks flushed, and sat down, her legs trembling. A tense silence filled the room. Morton was about to speak, to dismiss her words as the sentimental ramblings of a woman, when another figure rose from the back of the hall. It was Pastor Temperance Reed. The pastor's face was as stern as ever, but her eyes, when they met Rosie's, held a new light. "Mrs. Hale is right," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I have spent too much time preaching about the letter of the law and not enough about its spirit. Justice does not distinguish between a widow and a millionaire. That water is our shared inheritance. To sell it is to sell our soul. I, for one, stand with the Ashfords." The pastor's endorsement was a lightning bolt. It was a moral declaration that swayed the wavering center of the town. The meeting broke up not with a vote, but with a quiet, determined shift in the mood of the community. Morton had lost. That night, the air at the ranch felt different, lighter. Rosie and Colt stood by the spring, the water gurgling over the clean stones, the sound a gentle, constant promise. "You were good today," he said, looking at her. "Not the spring. Better than any lawyer." "I was just telling the truth." He fell silent, his gaze distant. "Seeing you stand up like that, it reminded me of my wife. She was like that, fierce. She would not back down from a fight, for a long time after she died. I thought that to love someone else would be to forget her, to betray her memory." It was the most he had ever spoken of his past, a glimpse into the guarded chamber of his heart. Rosie felt a wave of empathy for him. She understood the prison of the past. "I understand," she said softly. "And I have been afraid, too. When you offered me this home, this safety, I was terrified. All my life, I have been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's wife. My biggest fear is becoming someone's charity case. I need to know that I am standing on my own 2 feet, not just living in the shadow of your kindness." He turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "You are no one's shadow, Rosie. You are the strongest person I have ever met." They stood in a comfortable silence, their shared confessions hanging in the air between them. It was a new kind of intimacy, one built not on passion, but on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. They both knew that what was growing between them needed time, like a deep-rooted tree, not a flash fire. Their victory, however, only made their enemies more desperate. 2 days later, Eli was down by the creek, adding new details to his master map of the Ashford water system. He was so engrossed in his work that he did not hear the man approach until a shadow fell over him. He looked up into the hard, unfriendly face of one of the men he had seen with Silas Morton in town. "That is a mighty fine drawing. Boy," the man said, his voice a low growl. "Mr. Morton. He is a collector of fine maps." Eli scrambled to his feet, clutching the map to his chest. "It is not for sale." The man's hand shot out and grabbed Eli's shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. "Everything is for sale. Boy, you tell your sister and her cowboy protector that some things are best left alone. Accidents can happen, especially to little boys who wander too far from home." The man wrenched the map from Eli's grasp, crumpled it into a ball, and shoved it into his pocket. He gave Eli a little shake and then released him, turning and walking away without a backward glance. Eli stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding with a terror he had never known. Then he ran, tears of fear and rage streaming down his face, all the way back to the ranch house. When Deputy Hank Lozano heard the story, his face hardened into granite. He found the man, whose name was Lou, in the saloon, drunk and bragging about teaching a little brat a lesson. The crumpled map was still in his pocket. Hank arrested him for theft and making threats, the click of the handcuffs echoing in the suddenly silent saloon. But at the sheriff's office, Lou was uncooperative. He was a hired hand. He said he did not know anything about Silas Morton. He had just seen the boy's map and wanted it. There was no evidence, nothing but a boy's word, to tie the threat back to the man who had clearly ordered it. Morton was untouchable, protected by a wall of money and plausible deniability. The law had caught a foot soldier, but the general remained safe in his camp, planning his next move. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a feeling, a sudden, unnatural chill in the late September air that had no business being there. The sun, which had been warm and golden an hour before, seemed to shrink in the sky, its light turning thin and watery. Colt looked up from the corral fence he was mending, his gaze sweeping west toward the mountains. The peaks were gone, devoured by a bank of cloud the color of a fresh bruise. "Snow," he said, the word a puff of disbelief in the cold air. The ranch hands stopped their work, their face turning to the sky. Snow in September was a freak of nature, a violation of the seasons. It was also a death sentence for any cattle caught in the high country. A large portion of the Ashford herd was grazing in a series of alpine meadows connected by a narrow, winding ravine. A heavy snow would trap them, and the subsequent melt, funneled by the canyon walls, would drown them. Within minutes, the ranch was a hive of activity. Men saddled horses, checked ropes, and grabbed heavy wool coats. A rescue was not a choice. It was an imperative. "I am going with you," Rosie said, meeting Colt on the porch of the main house. He was buckling on his gun belt, his face set in grim lines. "It is no place for you, Rosie. This will be dangerous." She held up her hand, stopping his protest. "You do not know the quickest way to them. I do. Eli spent weeks drawing that ravine. He showed me every cutback, every rock slide, every shortcut. I can see the map in my head. I can guide you." He looked at her. At the absolute certainty in her eyes, he knew she was right. He had seen the boy's obsessive detail. He had also made a quiet trip to town that morning and spoken with Deputy Hank. The arrest of Lou had not placated him. It had sharpened his senses. He felt Morton's desperation like a change in barometric pressure. "All right," he said. His decision made. "But you listen to everything I say." Before they left, he pulled her aside. "At the top of the western ridge, there is an old, abandoned mining camp. There is a big iron bell there they used to signal quitting time. If real trouble starts, the kind we cannot handle. You get to that bell. You ring it 3 times. Wait, then 3 times again. Hank is expecting to be called to a poker game tonight. He will know it is not a game." She nodded, understanding the grim forethought. It was a premonition of a battle that had nothing to do with the weather. The first flakes began to fall as they rode out, a small party of 6 against the storm. The flakes were large and wet, melting as they hit the ground. But as they climbed higher, the temperature dropped, and the snow began to stick, a thin white blanket that quickly thickened, muffling the sound of their horses' hooves. Rosie rode near the front with Colt, her mind's eye superimposed over the landscape. "Turn here," she would say, pointing to an almost invisible game trail. "There is a washout ahead. We need to stay on the high ground." She was flawless, her memory a perfect replica of her brother's stolen work. They found the cattle huddled together in a box canyon at the end of the ravine, their backs to the wind, miserable and confused. But as the hands began the difficult work of turning the herd, Colt's eyes were drawn upward, to a ridge that overlooked their position. 2 figures stood there, dark silhouettes against the swirling snow. Even at this distance, he recognized the fine cut of Silas Morton's coat and the gaunt, hunched posture of Jebediah Crane. They were standing near a small, man-made rock dam, an old structure his grandfather had built to create a reservoir for the highest pastures. A terrible understanding dawned on him. The storm was their cover. "Rosie," he said, his voice low and urgent, "get the men and the herd moving back the way we came, now, and get to that bell." "What is it? What are you going to do?" "Just do it. Trust me." He spurred his horse, breaking away from the group and scrambling up the steep, snow-slick slope toward the 2 men. Up on the ridge, Morton held a long iron pry bar. "The opportunity is perfect," he said, his voice exhilarated by the raw power of the storm. "We break the dam. The melting snow does the rest. A flash flood wipes out his herd. An unfortunate accident, an act of God. He will be ruined." "And if he happens to be in the way," Jebediah added, a cruel satisfaction in his tone. "So much the better. The estate would then be forced into probate to cover his debts, and the water rights would be anyone's prize." They wedged their pry bars into a crack in the old stone wall, just as Colt reached the ridge, throwing himself from his horse. "Morton, this ends now." Morton spun around, surprise flashing across his face before it hardened into a snarl of hatred. "You should have taken my offer. Ashford." He swung the heavy iron bar. Colt dodged, the bar glancing off the rocks with a shower of sparks. The fight was a desperate, clumsy affair in the driving snow and slick mud. Colt was stronger, a man hardened by a life of physical labor, but Morton fought with the viciousness of a cornered rat. Jebediah, useless in a physical confrontation, scrambled back to the dam, trying to leverage his own bar into the weakening wall. Colt landed a solid punch that sent Morton staggering back, but as he pressed his advantage, Morton pulled a small pistol from his coat pocket He fired, the sound shockingly loud in the snow-filled canyon. The bullet tore a hot furrow along Colt's ribs, the impact knocking him off balance. He fell to one knee, the warm stickiness of blood spreading under his shirt. Through the white curtain of the storm, a new sound came, faint at first, then growing stronger, a deep, resonant clang, clang, clang. A pause, clang, clang, clang. Rosie. Morton heard it too, and a look of panic crossed his face. He raised the pistol again, aiming for Colt's head. But before he could fire, two riders burst over the ridge. It was Deputy Hank Lozano, his shotgun leveled, and with him, a man in shackles. It was Lou, Morton's hired man. "Drop it, Morton," Hank's voice boomed. "It is over. Lou here has signed a full confession. He decided he would rather be a witness for the territory than an accessory to murder. We have got you for conspiracy, for attempted murder, and about a dozen other things." As Morton stood frozen, a deep groan came from the dam. A large section, weakened by Jebediah and the pressure of the rising water, gave way, a wall of churning. Icy water and muddy slush surged down into the ravine. A collective shout of horror went up from the men below. Most of the herd had been moved, but a few stragglers were still in the direct path of the flood. With them was Eli. He had followed the rescue party, determined to help, and had been working to free a calf whose leg was caught in a rock slide. The roar of the water was deafening. He scrambled up the canyon wall, but his feet slipped on the icy rocks. He fell, sliding down toward the rising torrent. Rosie, who had just returned from the bell tower, saw him fall. A primal scream tore from her throat. Without a second of hesitation, she launched herself down the treacherous slope, half running, half sliding. The world narrowed to her brother, his small form about to be swept away. "Eli, you are my family." She reached him just as the first wave of water surged around his boots, grabbing his coat and pulling with a strength born of pure adrenaline. His weight, combined with the slick mud, was too much. They both started to slide, just as they were about to be pulled into the main current. A rope snaked around Rosie's waist. Two of the ranch hands, their faces grim with determination, had scrambled after her. They dug their heels in and pulled, dragging Rosie and Eli from the edge of the flood just as it crested, a monstrous wave of destruction that swept away everything in its path. Pulled to safety, Rosie collapsed onto the snowy ground, holding Eli in a desperate, shuddering embrace. The whole ranch, their entire world, let out a collective breath of relief. Up on the ridge, Hank had both Morton and Jebediah in handcuffs. Colt, clutching his bleeding side, stood over them, his face pale but his eyes blazing with a cold fire. The snow had begun to lessen, and through the clearing air, the full picture came into focus: the broken dam, the ruined ravine, the captured villains, and down below, the small, huddled group of survivors, their lives and their futures saved by a boy's map, a woman's courage, and the distant, timely ringing of a bell. The world returned in pieces, muffled and slow. The first thing Rosie was aware of was the clean, sharp scent of carbolic soap and the surprising softness of a real bed. The storm, the flood, the desperate fight, it all felt like a fever dream, distant and unreal. Then she felt a small hand on her forehead, and she opened her eyes. Eli was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his face pale and serious, a damp cloth in his hand. "You were very cold," he said, his voice a quiet whisper. "Dr. Miller said you needed to rest." She sat up, the room swimming for a moment. They were in one of the spare bedrooms of the main ranch house. Sunlight, clear and bright, streamed through the window. "Colt, is he—" "He is fine," Eli said. "The bullet just grazed him. Dr. Miller stitched him up. He is mostly just angry he cannot help with the cleanup." The cleanup! The memory of the devastation came rushing back. The ravine, the lost cattle, the broken dam. She pushed the covers back, her muscles screaming in protest. Every part of her ached. "You should rest," Eli insisted. I have rested enough. She found Colt in the main room, sitting in a large armchair with his arm in a sling and a thick bandage wrapped around his chest. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. When he saw her, a look of profound relief washed over his face. He tried to stand, but winced and sank back into the chair. "Stay put," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You heard the doctor." He managed a small smile. "I do not take orders well. You will take this one." The days that followed were a blur of healing and rebuilding. The community, galvanized by the events of the storm, rallied around the Ashford Ranch. Men from neighboring ranches rode over to help repair the dam and clear the debris from the ravine. The women of Dry Creek, organized by a surprisingly efficient Nora Quinn, arrived with baskets of food, clean linens, and offers to help. The change in their attitude toward Rosie was palpable. The whispers of suspicion were gone, replaced by a quiet, steady respect. They had seen her fight for her brother, for the ranch, for all of them. She was no longer the penniless widow, the outsider. She was one of them. A week later, the circuit judge arrived in Dry Creek. Court was convened in the town hall, the same room where Silas Morton had tried to sway the public with his silver-tongued promises. The room was packed, but the mood was somber, official. Morton and Jebediah Crane stood before the judge, their fine clothes looking out of place, their face pale and drawn. Deputy Hank Lozano laid out the case with methodical precision. He presented Lou's signed confession, detailing the conspiracy to sabotage the dam and ruin Colt Ashford. He presented Eli's original map, recovered from Lou's pocket, as evidence of the threat made against a child. Then Colt's lawyer, a stern man from Cheyenne, presented the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, the old leather notebook. He read aloud the clear, unambiguous language of Jonathan Ashford's handwritten water treaty, witnessed and signed by Chief Blackhawk. The judge examined the document, his expression unreadable. He looked at the faded ink, the ancient paper, and the two signatures that bound an old promise between two men of honor. The verdict, when it came, was swift and absolute. The court officially recognized the Ashford Treaty as the primary and unbreakable water right in the valley, superseding all other claims. Silas Morton was bound over for trial on charges of conspiracy, attempted murder, and a half-dozen other felonies. He was taken away in irons, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. For Jebediah Crane, the punishment was different. The judge looked down at him with an expression of profound contempt. "Your crimes, sir, are those of a vulture, picking at the bones of the grieving. You have used the law as a bludgeon to terrorize a widow. There is no room for your kind of law in this territory." He was not sentenced to jail, but his name and his fraudulent actions were entered into the public record. He was disgraced, his reputation shattered. He left Dry Creek the next day on the morning stage, a broken man who had lost everything because he had tried to take everything. In the wake of the trial, a new sense of order settled over the valley. One afternoon, a small delegation of women came to the ranch. It was led by the wife of the general store owner, a woman who had once looked at Rosie with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Mrs. Hale," she began, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "We have been talking. The dust storm, the fire, this terrible flood. It has shown us how fragile everything is. We are not prepared for hardship. We would like to ask you," another woman added, "if you would help us. You know how to manage books, how to keep accounts. We want you to help us organize a town reserve, a system for storing grain, preserving food, keeping a record of supplies so that we are ready for the next drought or the next bad winter." Rosie looked at their earnest faces. They were not offering charity. They were offering a position of leadership, a place at the very center of the community's life. It was a formal acceptance, a declaration that her skills were valued, that she belonged. "I would be honored," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The world healed. The grass in the ravine began to grow back, greener than before. the last of the autumn sunlight bathed the valley in a soft, forgiving light. Colt's wound healed, leaving a long, clean scar along his ribs, a physical reminder of the battle they had won. But it was the healing of the invisible wounds that mattered more. The fear in Rosie's heart began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. The guarded sadness in Colt's eyes was slowly being supplanted by a new warmth. One cool, crisp afternoon, he asked her to walk with him. He led her not to the pastures or the spring, but to a small, sheltered meadow on the west side of the ranch house that she had never explored. It was an apple orchard. The trees were old, their branches gnarled and heavy with the last of the season's fruit. The air was sweet with the smell of ripe apples and turning leaves. "My grandfather planted these trees," Colt said, his voice soft. "He said a man does not have a real home until he has a tree that will feed his grandchildren. My wife and I, we used to talk about building our house here." He stopped under the largest tree and turned to face her. He did not take her hand, but his presence was a warmth against the autumn chill. "Rosie, what I'm about to say is not a payment for a debt. It is not an offer of protection. It is a proposition. Between equals, this orchard, this land, it is the best part of the whole ranch. I want to sign it over, to make you a full partner, co-owner, so that you will always know that half of everything here is yours by right, not by my leave." Her breath caught in her throat. A partner, an equal. He was offering her the one thing she had never dared to dream of, a life where she was not dependent, but a pillar. Before she could respond, they heard a shout, and Eli came running through the trees, his face bright with excitement. He was holding a large, freshly drawn sheet of paper. It was his map. Redrawn from memory, but better, more complete. He had added the new stable, the repaired dam, and the apple orchard, in the corner, in his neat, careful printing. He had written a title. He held it up for her to see. Ashford Springs. It read, "Home is where there is water and laughter." He gave the map to Rosie. Then, with the unself-conscious wisdom of a child, he looked from her to Colt and back again, smiled, and ran off to chase a grasshopper, leaving them alone in the quiet orchard. Rosie looked down at the map, then up at Colt. Her heart was so full she thought it might break, not with sorrow, but with a joy so profound it was almost painful. She had found it, a place where she was not a burden, but a blessing, a place where she was not a widow, but a woman. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. He leaned down, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. She answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was not a firestorm of passion. It was gentle and deep and full of unspoken promises. It was the taste of late-season apples, the warmth of the autumn sun, the feeling of finally, after a long and brutal journey, standing on solid ground. It was not an ending, but a beginning. They chose to be married in the spring, when the valley was so green it hurt the eyes and the apple trees in the old orchard were heavy with blossoms. It was not a grand affair. There was no fancy church, no procession of carriages. They stood on the wide porch of the new house they were building in that sheltered meadow, a house whose foundation stones were set on the principle of partnership, its frame built with the lumber of shared resolve. The whole of Dry Creek came, not as spectators, but as family. They came in their Sunday best, their faces scrubbed and shining, their earlier suspicions and judgments washed away by the flood and replaced by a deep, abiding respect. Nora Quinn arrived with not one, but 3 of her famous apple pies, her sharp tongue softened for the day. Though her eyes were as keen and observant as ever, she fussed over Rosie's dress, a simple gown of pale blue cotton that Rosie had sewn herself, and tucked a sprig of apple blossom into her hair with a gruff affection that was more moving than any flowery sentiment. Deputy Hank Lozano stood beside Colt, his usual stern demeanor relaxed into a quiet smile. He had seen the worst of men in his time. had seen greed and violence try to tear this valley apart. Today, he was watching the best of it put things back together. Old Man Whitaker sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a hawk. His presence a quiet link to the ranch's long history and the old promises that had finally been honored. Instead of a string quartet, one of the ranch hands, a man with a surprising gift for music, drew a bow across a carpenter's saw, coaxing from it a sound that was sweet and mournful and hopeful all at once. The melody drifted on the breeze, carrying across the meadow, a sound as unique and resilient as the people gathered there. Pastor Temperance Reed stood before them, her Bible held in her steady hands. Her face, which Rosie had once found so severe, now looked merely strong, etched with a wisdom that had been deepened by humility. She did not preach of fire or damnation. She looked out at the faces before her, at the community that had weathered fire and flood and human wickedness, and she chose her text with care. She read not of rules or judgment, but from the book of Isaiah, her voice clear and strong. She spoke of a wilderness made glad, of a desert that would rejoice and blossom. And then she turned to the book of Micah, her eyes finding Rosie's and then Colt's. "What does the Lord require of you?" she asked. The words a gentle question, not a harsh demand, to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. In that moment, Rosie understood the pastor's journey as well as her own. They had both learned that true faith was not found in rigid doctrine, but in the messy, difficult, and beautiful work of applying justice and mercy to the lives of real people. When she placed her hand in Colt's, it was not the hand of a woman seeking rescue. It was the hand of a partner, calloused from work, strong from rebuilding. She was not marrying him out of gratitude for a roof over her head or protection from her enemies. She was choosing him freely, with a heart that was whole and a spirit that was her own. She was choosing this life, this land, this future, not as a haven from the world, but as her rightful place within it. And when Colt looked at her, he did not see a replacement for the wife he had lost. He saw a continuation. He had learned that the heart is not a finite vessel that can only be filled once. It is a spring, and love is the water that flows from it. To love Rosie was not to betray the memory of his first wife, but to honor the life they had shared by refusing to let sorrow be its final chapter. He was choosing to let the spring flow again, to water the ground and bring forth new life. Their vows were simple, their words plain, but they carried the weight of everything they had survived. They were promises forged in fire and tempered by storms, stronger than any legal document, more binding than any chain. The celebration that followed was full of laughter and good food, and the easy camaraderie of people who had faced down darkness together and won. The women who had once whispered about the penniless widow now gathered around Rosie, the head of their new town provision committee, asking her advice on storing preserves and calculating grain reserves. They did not see her as Colt Ashford's wife. They saw her as a leader, a woman of substance and sense. Later, as the sun began to dip below the purple mountains, casting long, golden rays across the valley, Eli appeared, pulling a small handcart. On it was a sign, beautifully carved from a single piece of pine. He had worked on it for weeks, painstakingly carving each letter, sanding each edge until it was smooth as glass. With a solemn importance that befitted the occasion, he and two of the younger ranch hands carried it to the main gate at the head of the long ranch drive. Colt and Rosie walked hand in hand to watch him, the whole party following behind, with Colt lifting him up. Eli hung the sign on the archway. The letters were deep and clear, painted a crisp white against the warm wood. It did not say Ashford Ranch. It said something new. Ashford Springs, water and welcome. As they stood there, a quiet murmur of approval rippling through the small crowd. Another sound began to fill the air. It was the gentle, musical sound of running water. The ranch hands, as a wedding gift, had spent the morning finishing the new irrigation ditch that ran from the spring, past the new house, and down into the apple orchard. The water, clear and life-giving, chuckled and gurgled in its new channel, the sound bright and joyful. It sounded, Rosie thought, exactly like the laughter of children. It was the sound of the future. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.